Hello, and welcome to season 5 of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I'm so thrilled you are with us this year. We are going to speak to some historians, to speak to some authors, to look at ways that the stories of history, his story, her story, their story, and our stories come together to demonstrate the ways that history shows us what's possible. I'm so grateful to have you joining me in this journey through the Royals, Rebels, and Romantics of history. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I am so excited to be here with Melita Thomas. I am just beyond excited because I got to meet her in person. You recall I went to the UK earlier this year and went to a wonderful day-long event at Southwark Cathedral and got to meet her and hear her speak about her book. And so I cornered her right there and asked her to be on the podcast. So I'm so excited. Welcome, Melita, to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Carol Ann. It was lovely to meet you back in April. And thank you very much for inviting me to join you on, because you've got a lot of people interested, I think, in your podcast, haven't you? I mean, it's a pretty popular place to be. So thank you for making time for me.
Well, I'm so excited. So I want to ask you before we get to the book, which I have behind me here, and you have another of your books behind you on your screen. And so I hope you're all watching on YouTube as well as listening. But let me start by saying or asking, what got you interested in history in particular and the history of the Tudors? What got you interested in that topic?
I think, like lots of people of my generation, it was those good old standbys, the BBC, The Six Wives of Henry VIII with Keith Michelle, and Keith Michelle will always be Henry for me.
Absolutely.
And then Elizabeth R, Glenda Jackson. And again, you know, when I think of Elizabeth on screen, it's always going to be Glenda Jackson. So they came out when I was a little girl. I lived in Australia, and they came out a little bit later there. And I remember watching them with my grandmother, who was British, and asking her all about it. And you know, she was interested in history as well, but she just, you know, didn't have a huge depth of knowledge. So after that, I just wanted to learn all about the Tudors. And I've got to say, I admit, I really just wanted to dress up. So I do now dress up as a Tudor lady.
Wonderful. Oh, we should have asked for that.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, that is wonderful. And, you know, that program was one that got me as well. I mean, Keith Michelle is wonderful. And I really was convinced Glenda Jackson was Elizabeth for quite a while.
Yes.
So you've got the one book, and I'm just going to mention this because The King's Pearl is about Henry and his daughter, Mary. So it's sort of a zoom in on a couple of people, and the book, and especially Mary, of course. And the book we're going to be talking a little more about is, let me grab it, 1,000 Tudor People. So let me ask, you've done sort of a zoom in on somebody and then sort of a wide spread. What was the difference in those two projects for you? And what drew you to Mary and then to such a big project as 1,000 People?
Actually, that's a really interesting question. I hadn't thought about it before, because there's actually an intermediary step. My second book, The House of Grey, which is about a family.
Yes.
So I've gone from a person to a family to a, you know, worldview. And I've always been interested in Mary. So following, you know, seeing Glenda Jackson, like lots of people, I was very interested in Elizabeth. And then I realized that actually Mary was also very interesting, very very unreasonably treated in the historiography, and I became more interested. In fact, I'm doing my PhD about Mary.
Right.
So I wanted to write about Mary, but the angle I took was her relationship with Henry VIII, because so much of the historiography just leaps over it or suggests that Mary was I mean, she and Henry obviously did have a difficult relationship for obvious reasons, but that wasn't the whole story. She wasn't sent to, live in the country forever without any contact with her father or the court. After Anne Boleyn's death, when Mary was forced to recognise her father as head of the church, she comes back to the court. She's integrated in the court. She's very close friends with particularly Jane Seymour and Catherine Parr. And Henry, Mary's the only child with whom he ever had an adult relationship,
Mhm.
because she was 31 when he died, and he was closest to her because she'd spent her childhood close to her parents. Apart from that tricky blob in the middle, he knew her much better than he knew his other children, and they had. And I suppose what interests me is, how did Mary square in her mind, the father that she'd adored as a child, but had then forced her to do something that was so against her conscience. But then later, he expressed he was very generous towards her. He gave her lots of gifts. They did archery together. They looked at gardens together. It's a very strange dynamic. So I wanted to look at that. And then one of the things I noticed when I was talking about Mary is the Grey family. Now, we all know about Jane, of course, but
Yes.
the Grey family are everywhere at the Tudor court. Henry VIII's cousin, Thomas Grey, second Marquis of Dorset, he's one of Henry's closest friends, and they spend a lot of time together, and his children are in Mary's household, and everywhere you go, there are Greys. And then, of course, it comes to the great debacle of Jane, and I wanted to know what had gone before. So the Grey family looks at really more or less from Elizabeth Woodville's marriage to John Grey. So quite a lot about Elizabeth Woodville at the beginning, and then the marquises and their wives and children, what have you. So that got me interested in connections and how people moved about together. And then that, I suppose, partly led to my PhD, which is about Mary I, but about social and political networks. And I'm using social network analysis to look at how people are connected by letters and gifts. And then I looked at how everybody in the Tudor world is sort of connected. And it isn't just about the court. We hear about, the psychodrama of the Six Wives, but this was a time of huge change and of opportunity for some people, not so much for others. But in the medieval world, I'm not saying that things were static, because of course they weren't, but there was more of a worldview of eternity, and everything sort of not exactly staying the same, but the change was more gradual. But in the 118 years of the Tudor period, change was massive. And there were lots of people, mathematicians and philosophers and explorers. And I thought, well, we don't really hear so much about those people. So that's 1,000 Tudor people.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I love that whole arc. And I apologize because I had missed the middle of it. But from Mary and then to 1,000 Tudor people, I love that idea. And one of the things I just want to ask you one question about Mary, and then we'll talk about some others as well, was Henry's relationship with her, which is really so interesting. And so I think from his point, strong, except for that blip in the middle, she may have felt differently. But I wondered, I had read before that Mary was the only person that Henry VIII ever really forgave, that he was unhappy with her, and then she was forced to accept him, and then he forgave her. He's not a forgiving person. Would you say that's true, that he forgave her and that she's supposed to be the only one he ever forgave?
Yes. The only other similar example, and I don't think it's quite so pertinent, is his sister Mary, the French Queen, and Charles Brandon for their marriage.
Okay.
So he forgave them, but they had to pay for it. And if you look at it, he was pretty sure it was going to happen anyway. It possibly didn't happen quite how he intended, but he knew that Mary certainly wanted to marry Charles, and then he goes and sends Charles to fetch Mary back from France. But you mustn't marry her while you're there. So Mary, he wanted, he's not a self-aware man, perhaps, but he did love his children. He loved all his children, and although a sentence that he expressed to the French ambassador, Marillac. This completely sums him up. Marillac's talking about will Mary be legitimated so she can make a marriage to one of the French princes? And Henry says, I love my daughter well, but myself and my honor more.
Oh, that is perfect.
Yeah, that one moment of self-knowledge in Henry's life.
Yes.
He wanted to forgive Mary. That's it. He wanted to believe her. I don't know that he ever really 100% trusted her, but he didn't push too far. Once she'd
Mhm.
accepted it, I think he was. So, for example, the Pilgrimage of Grace, um, Mary's name was on their lips, and there's absolutely no
Mhm.
evidence of her having any involvement or that she would ever have got involved in that sort of thing. But
Right.
she was never questioned about it. It was never. And there are a couple of other examples. She did get a warning from Cromwell once for talking to the ambassadors without
Mm.
um, consent, so to speak. And Mary sent back a very groveling letter saying, no, it's not what you think, and I'm terribly sorry. And if I ever misbehave, do let me know. But yeah, Henry wanted to be on good terms with her.
Yes. And I really love what you say. She did have a really great relationship with him early on when he was young and fit and healthy and able to have better relationships. Really, by the time Edward came
Mm,
along and he was excited about his son, but he didn't really have all that much of a personal relationship with Edward where he had with Mary early on. So
yeah.
that is a really, and then as an adult. So that's a fascinating way to think about that. And I do love that and your focus on that. And the Greys are fascinating too. You're right, they're everywhere. So let's talk about this fabulous
I have to
so
say, yeah.
did you yeah, we'll both hold ours up, right? It's so great. And it's more, it's more, I mean, look, it's and I just have a few markers because I have a couple of questions, but it's more of a project. I mean, it's just so beautiful and full of I mean, all of the family trees and the images. It's just such a great project. So did you start by thinking, all right, I'm going to find 1,000? I mean, that is such a big number. Did you start or just start how did you approach this project?
It started. You remember a few years ago there was a rash of books, 1,000 places to see before you die, 1,000 restaurants to eat in if you can possibly afford it. And I thought, 1,000 Tudor people. And at the beginning I was thinking, oh God, I'm not sure I'll get to 1,000, but I'll be scraping the barrel. And what I should have done was get my list and then work through it and then decide. But because I didn't think I would actually, well, I thought I would struggle to find 1,000, I just started with all the top names, of course, but I didn't just want the top names. But what I found was as you research one person, all these other people appear. So, you start with Shakespeare, obvious. So you start with some top, and then you get Ben Jonson, and then you get Thomas Nash, and then you get Gabriel Harvey, and then you get somebody, and you go down these rabbit holes. And then suddenly they're sort of multiplying, and I've got 250 people who could be in the book, of which probably 20 should be in the book but aren't. But by the time I got to my thing, I wasn't going back to the start, partly because of the production process.
Mhm.
You can't give a thing like this to a publisher en masse. So I was feeding it to them, and I didn't really want to go back and say, take that person out and put this person in. Um, so yeah, so I thought and I was also very keen to get as many women as possible.
Yes.
Now, these are not ordinary people in the sense you're only in the public record if you've done something unusual, interesting, famous. For a woman, you're only in the record really if you're the elite of the elite or you're a criminal or perceived to be a criminal. So the women are disproportionately transgressive. They're witches and husband killers and that sort of thing. Not because I think all Tudor women were husband murderers, but because that's what gets them into the record largely, unless they're members of the elite. So I did want to try and get a balance, and I think it's about a third women.
Yes.
Um, and I'm particularly curious about this sort of scientists, the mathematicians, the gardeners. I'm quite a keen gardener, and one of my other projects with my colleague from Tudor Times was the Tudor Book of the Garden, which is about gardens. So Thomas Tusser, and so that was a sort of a personal interest, so horticulture. Yeah, so it took me, and I had a lot of people that I knew about from the work I've done with Tudor Times, and obviously the two books, and just general reading. So I had a spreadsheet, and I also have a huge genealogy database. I've got 21,000 people in my genealogy database. So that gave me some clues as well as to people who might be worth investigating.
Oh, you mentioned deciding you could have 250 people, but they're not all going to be there. So you're going to have to select. How did you select, especially with the men, because you're looking for women? You mentioned that. But with the men, if you start with Shakespeare and you end up with this sort of rabbit hole network of all the people that he might have known or interacted with, how do you decide? How did you decide who gets in?
Well, as I say, some people are in who probably I would now drop and swap with some of the others, but partly finding people that you can actually find something interesting or useful to say about them. Because I wanted it's not an academic work in the sense that it's all footnoted, because you can imagine the size it would be if I had footnotes as well.
Right.
But for every single person, there's at least 2 academic journal articles about them that I consulted. So it had to be people that there's material about, because I mean I can't go back to primary sources for all of these. So there has to be good secondary, peer-reviewed historiography about them. And you don't want to end up, it's not some sort of scrape of Wikipedia, because you just can't go down that road. And even things like the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, which is a fabulous resource, as is the History of Parliament, but a lot of it's very out of date and very, what should we say, Whig in its sort of Protestant colonialist kind of view of the world. So that could be a starting point, but I needed to go deeper than that to find out the latest thinking.
Right. No, that's very interesting, because some of those more traditional sources haven't incorporated some of the latest thinking, some of the latest research, different ways of considering these people. So tell us, did anything, and I'm sure, so tell us about some of the surprises maybe in people you found.
Surprises. Well, actually, one of the surprising things, which I suppose I knew but didn't really think about, was how as the period progressed, they all became completely obsessed with the occult and witchcraft and demonic possession and things. So you don't hear much about that sort of thing at the beginning of the period, but by Elizabeth's reign, it does seem to be more of a Puritan thing. I mean, I'm not saying that, because obviously Catholics did believe in witches, and the whole Malleus Maleficarum thing was a Catholic thing. But it did seem to become an obsession with the more puritanical end of Protestantism, particularly demonic possession. So there's a number of people who were casting out demons or having demons cast out of them, and then clearly it becomes quite a lucrative business if you can advertise yourself as somebody who can exorcise demons. And there's a chap whose name escapes me at the moment. It will come to me. But anyway, he had Darrell, his surname was Darrell. He had a license to preach, and he was and on one occasion he managed to cast demons out of 7 people in the same household. And then the whole thing turns, there's an absolute uproar, and the town council of Nottingham call him in to get rid of a rash of demons that are infesting Nottingham, and the Archbishop of York gets involved and says, really. So the guy, he spends a year in jail, and he decides to retire after that. But yeah, so that sort of surprised me. Interesting sort of quirky things, sort of on a similar thing, alchemy and the Philosopher's Stone, and there's a chap called Cornelius de Lannoy, because Elizabeth I was very interested in the occult, or John Dee was one of her advisors. And this chap, Cornelius de Lannoy, managed to persuade the Queen that if she gave him a year, he would find the elixir of life and be able to turn base metal into at least 50,000 marks worth of gold. but he needed a whole laboratory and all the rest of it. So he set up with this lovely laboratory in Somerset House and working away and doing a bit of money lending on the side. Unfortunately, at the end of the year, he hasn't spun it into gold and he's clapped in the tower for abusing Her Majesty's trust.
Oh, that's a good, yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds a bit like a fairy tale that may have
Well, it does.
evolved.
Rumpelstiltskin. You wonder if that's how some of these things start. And
Yes.
actually, various people's marital escapades are funny as well. There's a chap called Rafe Rishton, and by the time he dies, there are 11 different matrimonial suits against him
Oh,
because he's got 3 wives, not wives, and there's adultery and a bit of and a bit of fraud and some forgery all going on in this very complicated story.
oh, see, these are wonderful. And these I feel like are people we wouldn't otherwise run across unless we're really looking for them and we don't know to look for them. So that's great. And that's one really interesting thing is people you can meet in these pages that you would probably not otherwise meet, even if you spend a lot of time reading
Yeah.
books about the Tudors. These are not people that make a lot of the books as the main character. But one of the things I also really liked, and you mentioned women, and so I'm just going to ask about a couple of people that, and so I'm just opening now this book that has been um that I have right by me all the time. Uh, Someone that I was really intrigued about and interested in, and she does feature here, is Agnes Tilney, who's the
Oh
Duchess
yeah.
of Norfolk.
Yes.
And we often see her more toward the end of her story
Mm.
when Catherine Howard is arrested, and then this story of her youth comes out. But actually, she has a really interesting life, her whole life. So, can you just share a little bit? I mean, she was one of my favorites, and I was so excited to find her here and learn
Yes.
more about her. So, tell us a little bit about her whole story, because that's the thing you get here is the sweep of her story, not just this one sort of dramatic moment.
Well, her story starts actually in the late 15th century. She goes to wait upon or be the gentlewoman attendant on her cousin Elizabeth Tilney, Countess of Surrey. And Elizabeth is basically the matriarch of the Tudor court because she marries twice and has loads of children. And her second husband, the Earl of Surrey, she has a number of children by, including Elizabeth Boleyn. Um, but Elizabeth Tilney died, and within weeks, her widow, months maybe, her widower marries Agnes, who's her cousin, and they proceed to have another half, maybe even a dozen children. I can't, because the father, he had 22 children over the 2 wives. And they all start being named the same in the second family because he's run out of names, which gets very confusing. So Agnes, she's then Countess of Surrey, so she's a very senior woman in the early Tudor court. Um, I don't think she had an official position under Elizabeth of York because she had been married around about the time Elizabeth died. So of course there was no queen then until Queen Catherine in 1509. She's too high ranking to be a lady in waiting or an attendant on an ordinary basis, but she's an extraordinary attendant, which means she attends high days and holidays. And she and her husband seem to have been on good terms, which is suggested by his speedy marriage of her, because she wasn't of a particularly high rank. So she's got a lot of stepchildren, or
Mhm.
yeah, stepchildren. So Elizabeth Boleyn and Thomas Howard, who then becomes third Duke of Norfolk. Her own daughter is Catherine, Countess of Bridgewater, is another very interesting one. And Agnes, as the matriarch of the Howard family, she does bring up quite a lot of Howard relatives and hangers-on, including her step-granddaughter, Catherine. I mean, the kind of idea that she was running effectively a bawdy house isn't really necessarily borne out by the facts. Gareth Russell's book on Catherine Howard's very good. Uh, she's a strong supporter of Anne Boleyn and falls out really with her daughter-in-law, her stepdaughter-in-law, Elizabeth Stafford, the Duchess of Norfolk, who's a strong supporter of Catherine of Aragon. And in fact, Agnes and Elizabeth, they vie for who's going to be who's of higher rank, who should go first, the Dowager Duchess or the Duchess.
Mm.
And Queen Catherine landed in Agnes's favour. In fact, although Agnes was born of lower rank, Catherine decided that she had precedence, which didn't go down terribly well with Elizabeth, even though Elizabeth did remain a strong supporter of Catherine. Well, partly because Elizabeth was the daughter of the Duke of Buckingham, so by birth she was very much higher ranking than Agnes. I think Agnes, yeah, I think she was. Oh no, she in 1520, 1520 at the Field of Cloth of Gold. Agnes stayed back in England, and she was one of the people who welcomed the French ambassadors with Princess Mary.
Okay.
Yeah, so she had, yeah, her children were interesting, and she had, yeah, a very busy life of one of the great ladies of the Tudor court.
I just think that's so interesting because we just don't usually meet her until, and as you say, it sort of sounds like she was running a household where the young women were all just carrying on and not well supervised, as if she didn't know what was going on. And yet she is this high lady of the court. We don't always see that about her. So I thought that was really interesting. So there are a couple of other, and I'm just going to mention a couple of people and you can tell us a little bit. And then I want to hear a little bit more about the book. But so Elizabeth, she has a lot of names. Lady Elizabeth Fitzgerald, and then Clinton as the Countess of Lincoln. And again, this is someone who's on the sidelines, but plays such an interesting part here because she's actually turns out to be the fair Geraldine.
Yes.
You know, and that we hear that phrase, but to associate it with a person and then learn more about it. So can you just tell us a little bit as well about her?
Yeah, well, I first came across her when I was writing about the Greys, because her mother, Elizabeth Grey, was the daughter of the second Marquis of Dorset, and she married the Fitzgerald. I can't remember whether it was Gerald Fitzgerald or Thomas Fitzgerald, because they're all Thomas or Gerald. Gerald Fitzgerald, whichever. Anyway, he was the Earl of Kildare, so he was a great Anglo-Irish nobleman, and there were increasing. Well, there's always tensions in Tudor Ireland. There's always tensions in Ireland. So she was his second wife, and they had two children, another Gerald and Elizabeth. But her husband, the Earl of Kildare, falls foul of Henry VIII, and he comes back to England. He's clapped in the Tower, and Elizabeth comes back with her two children, and they spend some time with her brother, Lord Leonard Grey, up in Leicester. But then the young Elizabeth, so Elizabeth Fitzgerald, is placed in the household of Mary and Elizabeth, because by this time they're sharing a household. So she's actually only a little girl when the Earl of Surrey writes about her as Fair Geraldine. So she was maybe 10, 8, 10, but you know, she was a child. But she must have been perhaps a pretty little girl, or very appealing in some sort of a way. Her first husband was Sir Anthony Browne, but he was quite a bit older than her. Then her second husband was Edward Fiennes de Clinton, whose first wife was Bessie Blount, which goes back to the whole everybody is connected to everybody else.
Yes.
But Elizabeth Fitzgerald, as a young girl, becomes very close to the Lady Elizabeth, later Queen Elizabeth, and remains one of her closest friends throughout her life. But as Countess of Lincoln, of course, she also has a role as a great lady, and as the supervisor of the Lincoln estates. Yeah, she'd be an interesting person to actually delve into a bit more. I don't know if there's a lot of archival material about her, but she'd be quite an interesting one to delve deeper in, because her husband, we don't hear much about Clinton, but Edward Fiennes de Clinton, but he was actually a very important Tudor courtier, and he starts out under Henry VIII. And then he's quite a confirmed Protestant. He's Lord Admiral under Edward. Supports Northumberland against Mary, but is then brought back into the fold. Mary forgives him, even though he's actually one of the men who marched against her. And he assists the Queen against Wyatt and Wyatt's rebellion, and eventually then becomes Lord Admiral again, has a good relationship with King Philip, leads the English navy against the French in the French War of 1557. And then under Elizabeth, he really blossoms and continues as Lord Admiral. So,
well, and it's such an interesting for someone to be able to succeed in Edward's court and in Mary's court and in Elizabeth's court. I mean, that's quite extraordinary. You don't see very many people. I mean, a lot of people who were successful with Edward just either left the country or kept their heads down, during Mary's reign. But for someone to succeed in all three is really quite extraordinary.
in 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 fact, I'm actually going to disagree with you there, Caroline, because that is one of the kind of myths of Mary's reign.
Okay, good.
That yes, a number of Protestants did go into exile, absolutely, like Catherine Willoughby, the Duchess of Sussex, and
Yes.
the more radical ones, the ones who wouldn't conform. But if you conform to the law under Mary, she didn't ask questions any more than
Okay.
Elizabeth ever did about what was going on in people's heads. Provided you rocked up to mass, didn't say a word, went home again, that was that. So Clinton, William Harbour, Earl of Pembroke, was in Mary's Privy Council.
Okay.
Many of the men who served Edward went on into William Paget.
Yes.
John Russell, Earl of Bedford, was Mary's Lord Privy Seal. Provided they conformed, they were fine.
Okay, well, that is good. I appreciate you clarifying and correcting me on that, because that is very interesting that both she and Elizabeth were pragmatic in some ways in, show up to the services and do what you're supposed to
Flout
do.
the law openly, and what's going on in your head is
up to you. Okay, that's great. So I've shared just a couple. I have many, many more, but I've shared a couple of my favorites. Who are some of your favorites that you met or got to know better in creating this book that, really stuck with you, or you were really excited to find out about and include? Who are some of the people that you just really became maybe fond of or really enjoyed getting to know better?
one of the really interesting ones is Agnes Tilney's daughter, Catherine Howard, Countess of Bridgewater, and she's only ever really talked about in terms of her niece Catherine Howard and being sent to the Tower with her mother for concealing Catherine's youthful misdemeanors, shall we say? Which I feel, just as a sideline, people talk about poor Catherine Howard as though she was some sort of raging nymphomaniac. She had. And just think in your own life, before, by the time you were 20, she'd had one boyfriend with a bit of petting and one proper boyfriend. This is hardly nymphomania, is it?
Right,
So
right.
poor girl, it just, very, very harsh treatment.
She hadn't ended up with Henry VIII. It would have been fine.
It was punishment enough, wasn't it?
Yes.
But to go back to her aunt Catherine, so Catherine in her youth had been married to a Welsh lord, Rhys ap Griffith, and as a border warfare, well, there wasn't border warfare in the sense that there had been previously, but there was a lot of rivalry around the marches of Wales still. And Rhys ap Griffith, he was the grandson of Rhys ap Thomas, who had been one of Henry VII's biggest supporters. And he was a very powerful lord in South Wales. And he felt very threatened by Lord Ferrers, who was another powerful lord. And anyway, they start having this little war. And Ferrers captures Rhys and puts him in, I think it's Carmarthen Castle. So Catherine raises an army of their retainers and besieges the castle, and she tells Ferrers she's going to burn it to the ground if he doesn't release her husband. And then she mounts a counterattack on his lands. So she's really almost, it's like a medieval sort of border warfare thing going on. Anyway, so poor old Rhys doesn't end well for Rhys, but Catherine comes back to the court, and she's married then to Lord Daubeny, or I never know how to say it, Daubeny, and she and he don't get on at all well. He becomes Earl of Bridgewater, and she's Countess, and they in fact have you can't have a divorce as we think of it, but you can have a divorce from bed and board. So they were sort of legally separated. but her daughter also gets into all sorts of trouble, because I think her daughter has, I think, lives with Lord Stourton without being married, and I feeling she might have even been hanged for murder of Lord Stourton, but I'd have to go back on that.
Wow.
So Catherine, Countess of Bridgewater, but she's nice because she never says anything against her niece Catherine Howard. She never gives any evidence against her, uh, and the only thing that's reported of her is that when Catherine, when she was young, was out in the park with, I can't remember if it was Mannix or Derham, uh, Catherine Bridgewater says, "Oh, don't stay out too late, darling. It'll ruin your complexion." But yeah, she never gives any evidence against her niece.
Well, that's interesting in many ways. And one is we almost think of Catherine Howard, the wife, Catherine, this one of the six wives, Catherine Howard, um, as being really isolated from any family. So it's nice to see these other family members who don't turn on her, don't give evidence, tell her to watch her complexion, that kind of thing. And that whole network. That's wonderful. And again, you see these lines going on in so many ways. One of the things you do as well in the book is you have sort of the royals in one section and then some of the higher nobility, the very top nobility, with a lot of charts, which I really appreciate, because you can see all the ways the families intersect and all of those intersections and how important that was at court. Now, as you put this together, starting from, Henry VII in 1485, going to 1603, I mean, that's, as you mentioned, that's a long time with a lot of change.
Mm-hmm.
You've mentioned a couple things, but what kinds of changes, because these people aren't in here chronologically, but as you consider the chronology from early Tudor times to later Tudor times, you mentioned this interest in the occult that sort of explodes or expands during Elizabeth's time. What other changes did you see over the course of the Tudors as you met all these different people and placed them within their networks and within families and grandparents and grandchildren, and changes over those times?
Well, of course, the big one is religion, and
Mm,
and one thing that is interesting is looking at how families were divided yet not divided by religion. So you could
mm,
take a family like the Throckmortons.
yeah.
George Throckmorton, he's a strong supporter of Catherine of Aragon, gets himself into a bit of trouble, but nothing too serious. He has 10, 12 sons, and daughters, and they all have children, and half of them become Protestant and half of them stay Catholic. So the Throckmortons are involved in the gunpowder plot, and but the other ones, the most extreme is Job Throckmorton, who's practically the John Knox of England, and was probably behind the Marprelate Tract, which was a whole series of pamphlets about how the Anglican Church and Elizabeth hadn't gone far enough down the road of reform, and yet you still see family connections between them and links, and they're still, we look back and we sort of see Protestant Catholic as black and white, but it wasn't necessarily for them. Certainly not in the mid period. It became more polarized as time went on. So that's interesting, seeing how families dealt with some of the issues. I think looking at women's education is interesting. At the beginning of the period, so if you take Queen Elizabeth of York, I mean, she was well educated for a princess of her time. Of course, she read and she wrote, and she spoke French, and she played all the musical instruments and danced, and had all the courtly graces, and
Mhm.
say read and wrote and spoke French and all those sorts of things. Catherine of Aragon was better educated. She was a very, very fluent Latin speaker, and she had an early humanist education, which she then wanted for Mary. So once you get to Mary's generation, the girls born in sort of 1510 to 1520, Thomas More's daughters, and then the Cook sisters. So there becomes a tradition of good education for elite women, which sadly sort of disappears in the 17th century when Princess Mary, who married William of Orange, her daughter was Queen Mary II. I mean, she could barely write her own name. We had this arc of wonderful female education that then in the next century kind of falls away. But the Cook sisters are fascinating. I mean, there's Anne Cook, Lady Bacon. She translated John Jewel's Apologia which was a sort of explanation of the tenets of the Church of England. Her sister Mildred Cook, who was married to Burghley, Elizabeth Cook, Lady Russell, and they're all very well educated. And then they're on the Protestant side of the fence. But some of the texts that the Protestant tutors used were the same ones that had been used for Mary, like Juan Luis Vives' works, of course, on the education of a Christian woman, on the institution of a Christian woman. And then on the other side, you've got Mary Roper, who was Thomas More's granddaughter. So there was Thomas More, Margaret More, Mrs. Roper, as Margaret Roper, she's more normally known as, first woman to appear in print with an anonymous translation. And then her daughter Mary Roper, who translated some of her grandfather's works. Jane Lumley, who wrote the first play in Greek, I think, to be performed in England. So women's education at the elite level is a very interesting arc over the period.
It's really interesting. And do you have a sense of why it fell off? I mean, it seems like as spectacular as some of these works are that we're seeing and these women who are learning, you would think it would just keep going. But was it?
I don't know whether it was possibly, I mean, Elizabeth herself was extremely well educated. I mean, her successor as Queen Consort, Anne of Denmark, and James, they were also very well educated. I don't know why. I think because I haven't really studied the 17th century, I don't know quite what the thinking was, but whether there came to be in the early period, particularly on the Protestant side, because of course that's what carried forward. There was a lot of emphasis on women being able to read the Bible and to and then possibly it became a bit more we can't have these women questioning us too much. There might have been a bit of a misogynist pushback on women raising their heads and disagreeing with their lords and masters, but I don't know that. That's just a speculation.
Well, that would make some sense. I mean, it's a speculation that could certainly, but it is very interesting to see that, and on both sides, as you say, the Catholic side and the Protestant side. All right. So as you were putting all of these people together and making it into this wonderful project, I'm wondering if there were, and you've mentioned just a couple, did you meet anyone in this process that you now think I need to know more about? And is that going to turn into, I guess what I'm getting at is what's to come for you? I know you're involved in many, many things. Melita is everywhere, speaking a lot. If you're lucky enough to be in the UK, you can find places to actually go where she is. But what else is happening? Are you finding people in here that are new projects for you, or do you have something underway to tell us about?
I do. Somebody who isn't, but in fact, I now have a list of from here to here of projects I would like to do. My absolute focus at the moment is to finish my PhD this summer, I hope.
Yes, and kudos on that. Yes.
I am commissioned. I've got a contract with Amberley Publishing, who published my first two books, and I've had this contract for years, and I refused to give them a date, but they've forced me to a date now. Honor Grenville, Lady Lisle, because she's a very interesting woman.
Oh, okay. Tell us just a little bit. Give us a little tease.
So we know more about Honor than any other woman in the Tudor period, and yet no one's ever heard of it, or barely heard of her. And she was a country gentlewoman. Her father had supported Henry VII, John, probably John, they're all John Grenville, and they were a Cornish family. And she married in the early 1510s, off the top of my head, Sir John Bassett, who is one of the big county families of Cornwall. And in fact, the Bassets are still the county family of Cornwall. The current incumbent, I think, was page to Her late Majesty. So they're still big cheeses in Cornwall. Has several children, Anne, Catherine, James, 3 or 4 who make it to adulthood. So John Bassett dies, and then we don't know how, we don't know, or at least we don't yet. She then next appears married to Arthur Plantagenet, Viscount Lisle, Henry VIII's illegitimate uncle. Quite how that happened, we don't know. But anyway, so she's married to Viscount Lisle, Lord Lisle, and he becomes captain of Calais, and they go to Calais, and there's 6 volumes of their correspondence, the Lisle letters, which you may have heard of, and I treated myself to the whole set of them for a special birthday.
Oh, that's
um,
wonderful.
and so there's so much, because what happened is that Arthur, he fell foul of Cromwell, was arrested, taken to the Tower, and all of their papers were seized. Now, Honor's daughter Anne was lady in waiting or attendant on Queen Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, the last 4 of Henry's queens, and she went on and she served Mary in Mary's reign as well. So yeah, so all the papers were seized. Arthur is clapped in the Tower. He's there for 3 years, and then he gets the message that, Henry understands that Uncle Arthur didn't mean any harm. It's all, he's and the poor fellow drops dead of a heart attack. Honor gets the message that her husband has been freed, and then on the next ship she gets the message that he's dead.
Oh.
And she goes back to Cornwall, and there's only one other mention of her ever again 20 years later. So where did yeah.
Oh, wow. So kind of a little mystery woven
Yeah,
into this
so
story.
that's that project. I've got a chapter in an academic book that's just been confirmed, writing about artistic patronage at Mary I's court. So there's lots of chapters, and I'm writing about the patronage of some of her courtiers rather than Mary herself, which I'm a little bit behindhand on.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I know the PhD you've mentioned that is about the networking. Tell us again what your PhD, because
yeah, so it's
interesting.
the social and political networks of Mary I, and I'm using social network analysis to look at it. So if you think about things like LinkedIn or Facebook, it's all on the premise about, the 6 degrees of separation. Who knows who, and how is power managed in a society, and you can see people who aren't necessarily in the biggest jobs are sometimes the most powerful, because if you take Cromwell, very powerful, because not because he's the king, but because he's the king's right hand man. But then you find, what about the people next to Cromwell? They've got a lot of influence as well. So you can do statistical analysis on it. It's really very interesting, and you see that people who don't necessarily appear in the history books. So one of whom, actually, I think probably does have quite a lot of, what is power, but there's soft power as opposed to power in office. James Bassett, who is Honor Grenville's son, he's a key figure at Mary's court, and he marries Mary Roper, who I mentioned earlier.
Oh.
So again, you can see these connections forming, but he's very, but he doesn't have any major official position, but the Queen clearly trusts him. She sends him with messages to Philip. He's kind of involved. So that's what I'm looking at, and how Mary built that network. And the key thing is, how did her use of her network enable her to succeed in 1553?
Yes, because that whole story, we know the outcome, and because we know it, it seems inevitable. Oh, well, of course, Mary would come to power, but it wasn't inevitable. And so that's really interesting how she was able to use her network.
I think in the background, she's caressing people.
Yeah, and that's really, because she had her eye on that prize. That is wonderful. That sounds absolutely fascinating. So I know it's PhD, but hopefully some of those get published. So hopefully
I'll have to think about how it would form an interesting book, because the tricky thing is all the diagrams, because they're very hard to reproduce. But yes, I would like to turn it into, well, ideally, I'd like to turn it into an open source interactive.
Oh.
But once I've got it, I need to see if I can apply for, funding to actually make this a public resource, and expand it, and it become the whole Tudor world.
Right. Oh, that would be wonderful. And to see how those connections get built, and then what comes from them. I can just imagine it just populating, in really cool ways. So yes,
it would be a life's work, but
yes, yes. Well, that sounds like a wonderful thing. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for spending this time with us. And again, this is such, okay, make sure, yeah, that way. This is such a great resource for finding people we don't always hear about, but who really made the Tudor period what it was, who, are the stories behind some of the bigger picture. But you mentioned people that we see fitting into these slots in just such marvelous ways. So thank you, Melita, for being with us, for sharing this with us, for teasing us a little bit with what's to come. Tell us where we can follow you, and I will put all of this in the show notes as well.
I'm on Twitter at Melita Thomas 92, I think. I don't Facebook as Melita Thomas, but the Tudor Times website, of which I am the co-founder and director, that's tudortimes.co.uk, and also Tudor Times Facebook page. I do a bit on Instagram, but it's kind of half me and half me private me and half me public me, and that's Mary the First. Only it's Mary First Networks on Instagram. My website, melitathomas.com. It's still fairly in its infancy, but it has links to a number of podcasts that I've done, information about where I'll be talking, and I'm also trying to put on it other kinds of Tudor information that might be interesting, like calls for papers, or so Caroline, if there's anything you want to share, take a look, and
okay,
events and that sort of thing.
Oh, great. Oh, that sounds wonderful. Well, this has been such a treat for me. I knew when I heard you in person. Well, I've read your stuff before, so I already knew. I was so excited to get to hear you and meet you in person, and so grateful to get to have you again here on the podcast. Can't wait to see these other projects come to be, and hopefully I'll get to you can get to see you again in person. But thank you.
So.
Thank you so much. And everyone, I'll have all the information about this, but do take advantage of all of Melita's work and her website and all the other things. There is just so much. So thank you so much for being here. And thank you everyone for listening, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I would really appreciate it if you'd leave a rating, maybe share with a friend. It helps other people get to know us. Thank you, and please join us again as we explore how history shows us what's possible.